There's a version of this that happens in the afternoon. Everything important is still undone. You haven't been sleeping. You haven't been watching something, scrolling, avoiding. You've been nearby the task, aware of it, orbiting it, periodically opening the document, closing it again, and somehow still unable to begin. And then comes the thought that arrives with it, right on schedule. This is laziness. This is who I am. This video is about why that thought is measuring the wrong thing, and what it's actually measuring instead. Here is the clinical definition of laziness, the one nobody says out loud but everyone operates on. A choice to avoid effort in favor of something more pleasant. That's it. Laziness, by that definition, requires two things. It requires that you chose, and it requires that something more pleasurable won out. Now apply that to what actually happened this afternoon. Was there something more pleasurable you chose instead? Not really. You weren't enjoying the avoidance. You weren't choosing a reward. You were just not starting, and you didn't know why. That is not what laziness looks like from the inside. Laziness, in the actual sense of the word, feels like a preference. Like choosing the couch because the couch is better right now. What you've been describing doesn't feel like a preference, it feels like a wall. And that distinction matters more than almost anything else in how you've been understanding yourself. Because here's the thing about that wall. If you've been using the word lazy to describe it, you've been applying a framework that was built for a completely different experience and wondering why it keeps producing the wrong answer. So let's talk about what's actually going on beneath that wall. Every task you do begins with a start signal. Not a decision, exactly. Something more automatic than that. A neurological prompt that tells the brain, begin now. In most brains, that signal fires relatively reliably. There's enough dopamine in the system to make initiation feel possible, even for tasks that aren't interesting, even for tasks that feel heavy. In an ADHD brain, that signal is inconsistent. Not absent, inconsistent, which means it sometimes fires. Under specific conditions, it fires reliably. When something is urgent, it fires. When something is genuinely interesting, it fires. When there's someone else in the room, a deadline, a witness, a consequence, it fires. And here is where the self-accusation gets its evidence. Because if you can start when something is urgent, if the signal fires when the stakes are high enough, then the conclusion feels obvious. You could always do it. You were just choosing not to. That conclusion is wrong. And it's been one of the most expensive mistakes in your self-understanding. The ability to start under high urgency or high interest does not mean you can start under ordinary conditions. Those are two different neurological states. Research on dopamine regulation in ADHD brains consistently shows that urgency and novelty create a temporary chemical environment that allows initiation to happen, and that environment collapses when the urgency disappears. That's not willpower switching on and off. That's a brain responding to the only conditions that reliably produce the signal it needs. And when you can't manufacture those conditions on demand, which is most of the time, the task sits there. Not because you chose to leave it, because the signal hasn't arrived yet. It makes complete sense that you've called this laziness, because from the outside, and often from the inside, it looks like a choice. It is not a choice. It is an absence. There's a specific internal test most women in this situation run on themselves. It goes like this. If I could do it when I really wanted to, when it was interesting, when the deadline was close, when someone was counting on me, then I can do it any time, which means every time I don't, that's on me. That test feels airtight. It has felt airtight for years, maybe decades, and it is producing a false result every single time. Here's what the test is actually measuring. It's measuring whether the ADHD brain can perform under conditions that temporarily solve the dopamine problem. It is not measuring capacity. It is not measuring character. It is measuring conditions. And every time the conditions weren't there, every afternoon that dragged on without a start, every important thing that sat undone got filed into a record that said, this is who you are, not this is what your brain needed and didn't have. The record is real. The interpretation is wrong. Here is the distinction that changes the record. Laziness is the presence of a choice towards something easier, something more pleasant. Task paralysis is the absence of a signal, not avoidance of effort, but the inability to generate the start. Those are neurologically different states. They look identical from the outside. They feel entirely different from the inside, if you know what to look for. And here's how you know which one you're in. In laziness, there's something you're choosing instead. In task paralysis, there's nothing. Just the weight of the undone thing, and the growing certainty that something is wrong with you for not being able to touch it. That weight is not a character assessment. That weight is a brain waiting for a signal that hasn't come yet. Not laziness, not weakness, not drama. A brain trying to initiate without what it needs to initiate. That's what you've been living with. And it has a mechanism, which means it is not who you are. If this video is opening something, if there's a question underneath it that sounds like, but how do I know if this is actually what's happening to me? There's a short quiz in the description built for exactly that. 5 minutes, specific questions, and at the end, language for what you've been living. Not a diagnosis, but a translation. The link is below. Now, here's what you can actually do with this understanding. Here is the one thing that changes when you understand this distinction. You stop trying to argue yourself into starting, because arguing assumes resistance, and resistance assumes a choice. If there's no choice happening, the argument has no target. What the ADHD brain actually needs when the signal isn't firing is not a lecture, not a reminder of how important the task is, not a calculation of how much time is left. It needs a condition, something small enough to be survivable, something that introduces enough novelty, enough structure, enough stakes to create the temporary environment where the signal can arrive. That looks different for every brain. For some, it's sound, a specific playlist, background noise, a timer. For some, it's location, a different chair, a different room outside. For some, it's witness, a body double, a check-in, knowing someone knows. None of those are hacks. None of them require more discipline. They're conditions. Scaffolding for a brain that needs the environment to supply what it can't always generate internally. And the internal objection that arrives here, if I need all that just to start, maybe I really am broken. That objection is the old test running again. The test that says, a brain that needs conditions is a deficient brain. Neurotypical brains also respond to conditions. They just need fewer of them, and they generate more of the chemical that makes initiation feel possible without external scaffolding. That's not a moral distinction. That's a neurological one. You are not the person who can't start. You are the person who has been trying to start without the conditions your brain requires, and interpreting the gap as evidence of who you are. Those are not the same person. One of them has been used to build a case against you. The other one is actually you. If you want to go further with what this opened, the quiz in the description will give you language for how this shows up specifically in your life. Not in general, in yours. Link is below, and in the pinned comment. What was the moment, the specific one, when you first started suspecting that what you were calling laziness might actually be something else? Here is what this video covered, and what you can do with it. The difference between laziness and task paralysis is not a matter of degree. It's a matter of mechanism. Laziness is a choice structure. Task paralysis is an initiation structure. They are neurologically distinct. They have felt identical from the inside because no one ever gave you the framework to tell them apart. Every afternoon that dragged, every important thing that didn't get started, every moment you looked at the undone list and thought, something is wrong with me, that wasn't evidence of a character flaw. That was a brain waiting for a signal it couldn't generate on its own, in conditions that weren't built to help it. Now you know what you're actually looking at the next time you're nearby the task and can't begin. Not a verdict, a signal problem. And a signal problem has a different solution than a character problem. It doesn't ask you to want it more. It doesn't ask you to be more disciplined. It asks you to look at what conditions are present and whether they're the ones your brain actually needs. That's a different question than the one you've been asking yourself for years. It's a smaller question, a more answerable one, and it starts from a completely different place. Not what is wrong with me, but what does my brain need right now? Not evidence, navigation. She was never the problem. Neither are you.